This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to this fascinating exploration of the origin of language and phonemic diversity. Today, we journey into the deep past to solve one of science's greatest mysteries. When and how did humans first begin to speak? We will examine the phonemic clock, a revolutionary method that uses the sounds of speech to trace our linguistic roots back to an African cradle. From the biological evolution of our vocal tracts to the global migrations that shaped modern languages, we invite you to discover the echoes of our ancestors' first words. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Phonemic Clock. Dating the Birth of Speech. The story of our species is written in many forms, from the fossilized remains of our ancestors to the genetic codes carried within ourselves. Yet one of the most defining characteristics of being human, our capacity for language, has remained frustratingly elusive to time. To look into the deep past of human communication, researchers have often turned to anatomical features like the shape of the vocal tract or the presence of specific genes like FOXP2. But while these studies suggest that other species in the Homo genus might have had the physical ability to produce speech sounds, they lack the resolution to tell us when a proto-language transitioned into the complex, structured systems we use today. Because spoken words do not fossilize, determining exactly when the first true languages emerged has been a scientific mystery for centuries, with the only direct evidence being the invention of writing a mere 5,400 years ago. Recent scientific inquiry has opened a new window into this ancient past by looking at language through the lens of phonemic diversity. A phoneme is the smallest unit of sound that can change the meaning of a word, the consonants, vowels, and tones that form the building blocks of speech. Just as geneticists use the accumulation of mutations in DNA as a clock to estimate when different populations diverged, linguists are now using the number of sounds in a language as a slow-moving clock to date the origin of speech itself. This approach relies on the observation that phonemic diversity evolves over vast timescales, influenced by deep historical and demographic forces that operate over tens of thousands of years. To understand how this clock works, we must look at the staggering variation in how many sounds different languages actually use. On one end of the spectrum, we find languages like Rhodocos, spoken on the island of Bougainville in New Guinea, which functions with as few as 11 distinct phonemes. On the opposite end, we find languages like Xun, spoken in southern Africa, which utilizes a massive inventory of 141 phonemes, including a complex array of click sounds found nowhere else in the world. This wide gap is not a matter of cognitive ability. Instead, the size of a language's sound inventory is shaped by cultural transmission and the size of the population speaking it. For decades, historical linguistics has relied on a method called glottochronology to estimate when languages diverged by looking at cognates, words in different languages that share a common ancestry. However, glottochronology hits a wall relatively quickly because words are subject to constant social and historical pressures. Recent research indicates that the frequency of word use predicts 50% of the variation in rates of cognate change, meaning that even the most stable words have a limited half-life. In the Indo-European language family, for example, the average word half-life is about 2,530 years. Beyond 10,000 years, the signal becomes so noisy that it is impossible to reconstruct a common ancestor. Phonemic diversity offers a way to circumvent this temporal limit, because the total number of sounds available in a language's inventory appears to change much more slowly than the words themselves. The worldwide pattern of these sounds contains a statistical signal of the expansion of modern humans across the planet. This approach relies on the observation that phonemic diversity evolves over vast timescales, driven by a global pattern of clinal decline. As human populations left Africa, they moved in a series of waves, and each migration event acted as a bottleneck that reduced the diversity of the sounds carried by the splinter groups. This drift loss assumption is subject to ongoing debate, but it provides the foundational metric for the clock. The further a language is from the African cradle, the fewer sounds it tends to possess. African languages today possess the largest phonemic inventories in the world, while the smallest inventories are found in South America and Oceania, the last regions of the globe to be colonized by humans. The fact that languages outside of Africa have not yet recovered the level of phonemic diversity found in the African cradle suggests that the process of accumulating new sounds is incredibly slow. To calibrate this clock, researchers have looked for natural experiments in history, instances where we know exactly when a population settled a specific area and how much their language has changed since then. One such experiment involves the colonization of mainland Southeast Asia and the Andaman Islands. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that these regions were settled between 45,000 and 65,000 years ago. By comparing the languages in these regions, scientists can estimate a rate of phoneme accumulation. Imagine three populations: a parent population, an island population, and a mainland population. When they first diverge, all three share a similar level of phonemic diversity. The island population, restricted by geography and a smaller speaker base, tends to maintain a stable but small inventory of sounds. Meanwhile, the mainland population expands, its numbers grow, and it comes into contact with other groups. Over tens of thousands of years, this mainland population begins to recover its phonemic diversity, slowly adding new consonants and vowels. By measuring the difference between the diversity of the isolated island languages and the expanded mainland languages, and knowing the time elapsed since they diverged, we can calculate a net rate of phoneme gain. Using the data from the Southeast Asian calibration, mathematical models have been constructed to project the timeline of language even further back. These models are explicitly agnostic about the particular mechanisms of change, such as how a specific consonant might split into two, and instead capture only the net effect of phoneme gain or loss over time. Two primary models have been tested: a linear model, where phonemes are added at a constant rate, and an exponential model, where the rate of addition depends on the number of phonemes already present. Both models require an estimate of the starting diversity, or P0. For this, researchers tested values of 11, representing the minimum known inventory, and 29, the global average. When these models are applied to the high phonemic diversity found in Africa today, the results point to an origin for present-day languages that is far older than many previously thought. The estimate suggests that the languages we speak today trace their roots back to the Middle Stone Age in Africa, a period characterized by the emergence of modern human behavior and complex stone tools. The phonemic clock indicates that language did not suddenly appear 50,000 years ago as a great leap forward that triggered our migration out of Africa. Instead, the data suggests that complex speech was likely a much older, gradual adaptation that was already well established within African populations long before the first groups began to settle the rest of the world. The implications of this slow clock are profound for our understanding of human history. If language has been evolving and accumulating complexity since the Middle Stone Age, it means that the mental and social structures required for speech were being refined over hundreds of thousands of years. This linguistic data provides a unique perspective that genetic and anatomical data cannot reach on their own. While genes can tell us when populations split, and fossils can tell us when our throats became capable of making certain noises, the phonemic clock tells us about the history of the information system itself. By focusing on the sounds rather than the words, we are able to see past the 10,000-year horizon that has traditionally limited historical linguistics. We see a global pattern where the most complex sound systems remain in the heart of Africa, and the most simplified systems are found at the furthest edges of human migration. This clinal loss of diversity is a ghost of our ancient journey, a statistical echo of the countless generations of humans who moved across continents carrying their languages with them. Each new settlement was a bottleneck, a moment where some of the original African diversity was left behind, and the slow process of recovery began anew in each new land. The math of the phonemic clock suggests that for a language to reach the level of 141 phonemes, it couldn't have started just a few thousand years ago. It demands a timeline that stretches back into the deep history of our species in Africa, long before we ever set foot in Europe, Asia, or the Americas. This research marks a significant shift in the study of human origins, moving language from the category of a recent cultural invention to a deep-seated evolutionary trait. If the clock is correct, and our ancestors were already masters of complex speech in the Middle Stone Age, what does the specific geographic distribution of these sounds tell us about the exact location of that first African cradle? Chapter 2. The African Cradle. To understand how the sounds of our languages today can point us toward a single point of origin, we must first look at a concept borrowed from the world of biology known as the serial founder effect. In genetics, this describes a phenomenon where a small group of individuals breaks off from a larger, more diverse parent population to establish a new colony. Because this splinter group is only a fraction of the original population, it can only carry a fraction of the original genetic diversity. If a smaller group then breaks off from that new colony to move even further away, the diversity is filtered once again. Over many generations and many migrations, this process creates a predictable pattern. Genetic diversity is highest at the point of origin and gradually declines the further a population travels from that starting point. When researchers applied this same logic to the sound systems of human languages, they discovered a startlingly similar pattern. In a massive analysis of over 500 languages from across the globe, a clear geographic trend emerged. This study utilized a standardized metric known as total normalized phoneme diversity, which carefully weights the number of vowels, consonants, and tones within a language to provide a comprehensive picture of its complexity. The languages that possess the most complex and varied inventories of sounds are located in Africa, particularly in the central and southern regions of the continent. As one moves away from Africa, through the Middle East, into Eurasia, and finally into the Americas and the islands of the Pacific, the number of distinct sounds used in local languages steadily drops. This global decline, or cline, provides a linguistic map of the ancient human journey out of Africa that began roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago. The data reveals that African languages are the champions of phonemic richness. Some languages spoken in southern Africa, for instance, utilize a massive repertoire of over 100 phonemes. A prime example is Xun, which functions with 141 distinct sounds. This includes not only standard consonants and vowels, but also rare and complex sounds like clicks. These click sounds, produced by creating a vacuum with the tongue and then releasing it with a sharp pop, represent some of the most intricate articulatory maneuvers in human speech. On the opposite end of the human migration route, we find languages like Rotocus, spoken on the island of Bougainville in New Guinea, which functions with a remarkably small inventory of only 11 phonemes. In South America and the remote corners of Oceania, the sounds of speech are often stripped down to their most basic elements, sometimes using as few as 13 distinct units, as seen in Hawaiian. This pattern is not a coincidence of geography or a result of different cognitive abilities among populations. Instead, it is the signature of a serial founder effect acting on human culture. When the first groups of modern humans began their expansion out of Africa, they were effectively carrying a sound library with them. Each time a small group moved into a new territory, the size of their population likely decreased during the initial settlement phase. In these small, low-density groups, the transmission of complex sound systems becomes more fragile. If a language has a very large number of sounds, some of those sounds might be rare or difficult to produce. In a small group, if the few elders who use a specific sound die before passing it on perfectly to the next generation, or if children fail to master the subtle differences between two very similar sounds, that phoneme can be lost forever. While the mathematical models used to track this decline are explicitly agnostic about the particular mechanisms of change, measuring only the net effect of phoneme gain or loss, scientists have identified several theoretical drivers for this process. One is simple copying error. Language is learned through imitation, and in a small population, there are fewer models to learn from. If a child misinterprets a sound and there aren't enough other speakers to correct that mistake, the new, simplified version can become the standard. Another mechanism is a form of Darwinian competition between sounds. In a language with a massive inventory, many sounds are very close to one another in terms of how they are produced or how they are heard. In the high-pressure environment of a small, migrating group, there is a natural tendency toward efficiency and clarity. Sounds that are too similar may merge into one, or complex sounds that require high levels of precision may be replaced by simpler ones that are easier to transmit reliably. The relationship between population size and phonemic diversity is a cornerstone of this research. Modern statistical analyses have confirmed a positive correlation between the number of people who speak a language and the number of sounds that language uses. However, advanced computer simulations have clarified that the driving force behind the global climb is specifically population density rather than just absolute population size. In areas where humans are packed more densely, the linguistic signal remains more robust. Furthermore, the number of surrounding languages plays a crucial role. Phonemes, much like words, can be borrowed through contact. In high-contact areas, languages act as reservoirs for one another, allowing diversity to be maintained or even increased through cultural exchange. This explains why Africa, a region of high linguistic contact and long-term population stability, has maintained such vast sound inventories, while isolated groups moving into new territories saw their diversity thin out. To test whether this signal of an African origin could truly survive for tens of thousands of years, researchers have turned to simulations that recreate the out-of-Africa dispersal. These models simulate tribes moving across a digital map, accounting for geographic constraints and waypoints. A critical element of these models is the Sinai Peninsula, which acted as a narrow corridor or bottleneck through which all migrating groups were forced to pass. By grounding the simulations in these real-world geographic waypoints, researchers were able to see how the serial founder effect would naturally unfold. The results were remarkable. The simulations showed that the geographic climb of phonemic diversity is incredibly resilient. Even after 300,000 years of simulated history, the signal of the original starting point remains statistically detectable. This directly counters the long-held intuition among traditional linguists that all traces of a common origin would be erased by the constant churn of language change within 10,000 years. The search for the best fit origin of this global pattern led researchers to a specific region of the world. By testing thousands of different points across the globe as potential starting locations, they looked for the coordinate that most strongly predicted the decline of phonemes with distance. The statistical sweet spot consistently pointed to southwestern Africa. This area, which includes the Kalahari Desert and the surrounding regions, is home to the most phonemically diverse languages on Earth today. The fact that the highest diversity is concentrated here supports the idea that this region was the cradle from which modern human language first began to spread. This geographic data provides a powerful cross-check for the timeline of human evolution, reinforcing the conclusion that complex speech was already well established by the Middle Stone Age. As humans moved through the Sinai bottleneck and into the vast expanses of Eurasia and the Americas, they were often living in smaller, more isolated groups. Each new frontier was a filter that removed some of the original African diversity. By the time humans reached the furthest edges of the globe, the tip of South America or the remote islands of the Pacific, their languages had undergone a series of phonemic thinnings. This explains the dramatic difference between the sound systems like Hun and a language like Rhodokas. One has remained in the heart of the original diversity, bolstered by surrounding languages and high population density, while the other is the result of a long chain of migrations and bottlenecks. The discovery of this ancient signal in our sounds has changed the way we think about the relationship between biology and culture. It shows that the same forces that shaped our DNA, migration, isolation, and the founder effect, also shaped the way we speak. Just as we can trace our genetic ancestry back to a small group of ancestors in Africa, we can now begin to trace our linguistic ancestry back to that same cradle. We are not just a single genetic family, we are a single cultural family that has been carrying the echoes of our first words with us for tens of thousands of years. As we look at the map of global speech sounds, we see the ghost of our ancestors' footsteps. Every vowel in a European language, every tone in an Asian language, and every click in an African language is a piece of a puzzle that tells the story of how we became human and how we conquered the world. The phonemic clock has given us a way to hear the whispers of our deep past, providing a timeline for the birth of speech that is written not in stone, but in the very air we breathe when we talk. Yet, as compelling as the evidence for a single African cradle appears, it has raised fundamental questions about how we define linguistic complexity, and whether a single point of origin is the only way to explain the sounds of the world. Chapter 3. The Babel Paradox. The proposal that human language can be traced back to a single cradle in southwestern Africa through a slow-moving phonemic clock was met with immediate and intense scrutiny from the global scientific community. While the elegance of the serial founder effect model provided a bridge between genetics and linguistics, many researchers argued that the evidence was more an artifact of how data is collected and analyzed than a true reflection of prehistoric reality. This skepticism ignited a debate that has forced a re-evaluation of how we define linguistic complexity and how we map the deep history of our species. One of the primary challenges to the African origin theory centers on the quality and handling of the linguistic data itself. Much of the early research relied on large-scale databases that categorize languages into broad bins, for example, grouping vowel systems into simple categories of small, medium, or large. Critics pointed out that this kind of simplification could lead to significant distortions. When a language with 7 vowel qualities is placed in the same large category as a language with 20, the high-resolution signal needed to track ancient migrations is effectively truncated. When researchers began to look at raw phoneme counts rather than these binned averages, the global map of diversity started to shift. Using these unsimplified counts, a different picture emerged. While it is true that many African languages possess large inventories, they do not necessarily hold a monopoly on phonemic richness. In some analyses, the highest levels of vowel diversity are found not in Africa, but in Eurasia. For instance, Germanic languages and certain Wu Chinese dialects spoken in southern Shanghai possess some of the most complex vowel systems in the world, with some dialects utilizing up to 20 distinct vowel qualities. Standard Swedish, too, features at least 16 vowel qualities, a number that exceeds many of the languages found in the supposed African Cradle. Similarly, while Africa is home to many tonal languages, the most complex tonal systems, such as those found in the Com language of southwest China with its 15 distinct tones, are located in Asia. When this raw, unsimplified data was plugged into the same statistical models used to support an African origin, the results often pointed elsewhere. Some researchers found that a best-fit origin for modern language diversity could just as easily be located in Central Asia. Specifically, researchers like Wang and his colleagues identified the region near Ashgabat in modern-day Turkmenistan as a statistically superior best-fit coordinate for the origin of language diversity. They argued that if a common origin exists, a Eurasian locus is a more appropriate fit because it aligns with the traditional location of the Tower of Babel, suggesting that the cradle might have been thousands of miles away from the Kalahari. Furthermore, the statistical strength of the linguistic signal has been called into question. Researchers such as Perez Losada and Fort have noted that the correlation between phonemic diversity and distance from Africa is significantly weaker than the correlations found in genetics. While genetic diversity shows a robust correlation of roughly -0.885 with distance from Africa, the linguistic correlation sits at a much more fragile -0.313. This discrepancy suggests that the linguistic signal is far more susceptible to noise and may not be strong enough to support a definitive out-of-Africa narrative for speech. Beyond the raw numbers, the methodology of identifying an origin point has been criticized for being potentially biased by the very geography of the Earth. While previous models relied on geographic waypoints established in earlier dispersal theories to constrain migration routes, critics argue these fixed paths create an inherent mathematical bias toward an African origin. Statistical simulations have shown that even when language data is randomized, certain regions, particularly Africa, are a priori more likely to appear as origins because of the way migration routes are constrained by land masses. Because the models assume that intercontinental migration must pass through fixed waypoints, any clinal pattern in the data will naturally tend to point back toward the first link in that chain. In one revealing set of simulations, researchers randomly reassigned languages to different coordinates within their own language families. They found that even with this randomized data, the model still produced a significant negative correlation with distance from Africa nearly 100% of the time. This suggested that the out-of-Africa signal in linguistics might be a statistical ghost, a result of the current distribution of language families and the way we measure distance, rather than a true record of a serial founder effect from the Middle Stone Age. Another significant point of contention is the role of consonants versus vowels and tones. The original models often gave equal weight to these three components, but they are not distributed equally across the globe. Some critics argued that this weighting was arbitrary and heavily biased the results toward Africa. When the data is corrected for the size of the speaker community and the specific linguistic genus, some studies found that the largest overall phoneme inventories are actually found in North America. This finding directly contradicts the idea that the Americas, as some of the last places to be settled, should have the most thinned-out sound systems. The underlying mechanism of phonemic loss has also been questioned. In the world of biology, genetic drift is a well-understood process, but language is a cultural system governed by different rules. Researchers Lupien and Dale proposed an alternative known as the linguistic niche hypothesis, which suggests that population size and social structure influence complexity in ways that contradict the drift loss model. According to this view, in a small, isolated society where everyone shares a vast amount of background information, languages can afford to become more complex and esoteric. They can develop rare speech sounds because the burden of learning is shared by a stable group of native speakers who interact constantly. In contrast, when a language is spoken by a very large, diverse population, or is learned by many non-native speakers, as is the case with modern global languages, there is a pressure towards simplification. To remain an effective tool for communication between strangers, the language must become more transparent, shedding its most difficult sounds and irregular rules. If this hypothesis is correct, then the small groups of humans who first migrated out of Africa might have actually increased their phonemic diversity as they settled into isolated pockets of the world rather than losing it. The debate also touches on the fundamental question of monogenesis versus polygenesis, whether language began once in one place or emerged independently in multiple populations. While the out-of-Africa model strongly favors a single origin, some scholars suggest that the capacity for symbolic communication might have been a latent potential in many early human groups. Alternative social theories suggest language emerged from widespread transformations in group trust rather than a single genetic event, shifting the focus from biological mutations to the evolution of cooperation. This perspective shifts the focus toward the complex ways that languages interact with their environment. Some researchers have found that factors like climate can influence the sound of a language. For example, there is evidence that tonal languages are less common in very dry climates. The physiological control of pitch requires a certain level of humidity to maintain the elasticity of the vocal folds. In arid environments, the vocal folds become dehydrated, making the subtle pitch distinctions necessary for tone harder to produce accurately. Others have pointed out that the degree of contact between different languages is a much stronger predictor of phonemic diversity than distance from any origin point. In regions where many different languages are spoken in close proximity, such as the Caucasus, languages tend to borrow sounds from each other, leading to larger inventories. These horizontal processes, borrowing, bilingualism, and language contact, can happen very quickly and can easily overwrite any ancient signal of migration. Critics argue that even if a serial founder effect did occur 70,000 years ago, it is highly unlikely that its signal would survive the thousands of years of subsequent wars, trade, and population movements that have reshaped the linguistic map. They suggest that the patterns we see today are much more likely to be the result of recent history, the last 5,000 to 10,000 years of agricultural expansion, rather than the first steps of our species. To address these concerns and the broader replication crisis that has troubled the social sciences, some scientists are advocating for a maximum robustness approach. Instead of looking for a single correlation between distance and sounds, researchers like Markov are building complex causal graphs that incorporate every available variable: population size, geographic spread, climate, social structure, and genetic history. This approach led to the creation of the CHIEL database, a public repository designed specifically to explore these complex causal links and resolve conflicting hypotheses. By looking at how these systems co-evolve, researchers hope to move past the limitations of simple mathematical models. Even the way we measure diversity has come under fire. In genetics, diversity refers to the variation within a population of individuals. But in the phonemic models, it refers to the size of the inventory used by a whole language. Some researchers have pointed out that the languages of West Africa and New Guinea actually show the lowest variability in their inventory sizes, which is the opposite of what one would expect from a point of origin. Under a serial founder effect, the point of origin should show the highest variability, as it contains all the original lineages before they were filtered by migration. These challenges have led to the proposal of more complex scenarios. Instead of a single origin in Africa, some models that account for both linear and quadratic distances suggest multiple potential centers of linguistic innovation. These include regions in East Africa, the Middle East, the Caucasus, and even New Guinea. One model found that adding a quadratic factor, which accounts for the possibility that diversity might first decrease and then increase again, pointed to New Guinea as a potential origin for a separate branch of linguistic development, characterized by smaller but highly specialized sound inventories. The search for the origin of language remains one of the hardest problems in science because it sits at the intersection of so many different fields, each with its own standards of evidence. For a geneticist, the clinal pattern of phonemes is a familiar signature of human expansion. For a historical linguist, the idea that a sound inventory could remain stable for 70,000 years is a radical and unproven claim. For an archaeologist, the timeline provided by the Phonemic Clock is a welcome confirmation of the Middle Stone Age record, but one that still lacks a direct smoking gun in the form of recorded speech. This ongoing debate has transformed the study of language from a search for a single first word into an investigation of the dynamic forces that shape human communication. It has highlighted that the sounds we use are not just random labels, but are deeply influenced by our biology, our social structures, and our history of interaction with others. Whether the first complex languages were spoken in the Kalahari, the steppes of Central Asia, or the mountains of the Caucasus, the diversity of sounds we hear today is a testament to the incredible flexibility of the human mind. If the geographic distribution of sounds is not a simple map of migration, what other forces were acting on the human body to make speech possible in the first place?
Chapter 4. The Biological and Social Architecture of Speech.
The evolution of human speech is as much a story of hardware as it is of software. While we often focus on the cognitive brilliance required to string sentences together, we must first look at the biological machine that makes those sounds possible. Human language is unique not just because of the complexity of our thoughts, but because of the unprecedented way we harness our physical anatomy, mechanisms originally designed for the basic survival tasks of breathing and eating, to perform the intricate articulatory gymnastics of speech. To understand how we moved from the simple calls of our ancestors to the complex grammars of today, we have to examine the physiological and social pressures that reshaped the human body and mind over millions of years. One of the most striking differences between humans and our closest primate relatives lies in the architecture of the vocal tract. In most mammals, the tongue is a long, flat structure contained almost entirely within the mouth, attached at the rear to a hyoid bone situated high in the throat. In contrast, the human tongue has an unusual circular sagittal contour, with much of its mass positioned vertically down an extended pharynx. This repositioning means that the human supralaryngeal vocal tract is essentially two tubes, one horizontal in the mouth and one vertical in the throat, that are almost equal in length and joined at a nearly right angle.
This 1-to-1 ratio is a biological masterpiece for communication. As we move our jaws and tongues, we can vary the cross-sectional area of these two tubes independently by a ratio of as much as 10-to-1. This specific mechanical capability is the reason humans can produce the distinct quantal sounds of vowels like I, U, and ah. These vowels are the most common in the world's languages because they yield consistent, distinctive acoustic results even when they are not performed with perfect accuracy, providing a robust foundation for a digital system of speech. The mobility of our faces also underwent a radical transformation. Our ancestors, the haplorhines, made a pivotal shift from nocturnal to diurnal activity. This transition led to the loss of the rhinarium, the wet nose common to many mammals, which is tethered to the upper lip. As the rhinarium disappeared, the upper lip became detached and highly mobile. This allowed the facial muscles, once primarily used for olfactory functions or basic movements, to be co-opted for complex expressions and the fine-tuned labial articulations, the pops, hums, and whistles that characterize human speech. This anatomical configuration came with a significant evolutionary cost. Because our larynx or voice box is positioned so much lower than in other primates, the pathway for food and the pathway for air cross in a way that creates a genuine risk of choking. In other mammals, the epiglottis can make contact with the soft palate, effectively separating the respiratory and digestive tracts. Humans lost this safety feature. For such a dangerous trait to be preserved, the benefits must have been extraordinary. Researchers like John Ohala and W. Tecumseh Fitch have argued that the lowered larynx originally evolved for size exaggeration. A lower larynx allows a creature to produce deeper resonant frequencies, making the individual sound larger and more threatening than they actually are. This theory is bolstered by the fact that a second descent of the larynx occurs specifically in human males at puberty, functioning as a permanent threat or display mechanism. While this trait may have begun as a tool for intimidation, it was eventually co-opted for the much more versatile purpose of articulate speech, providing the acoustic space necessary for a wide range of vowels. The hardware of speech also required a specialized power source, a highly refined system of respiratory control. When we speak, we recruit intercostal and interior abdominal muscles to precisely regulate the release of air from our lungs, extending exhalations and shortening inhalations to maintain the flow of a sentence. Evidence from the fossil record suggests this was a gradual development. The enlargement of the vertebral canal, which houses the nerves that control these breathing muscles, is not found in early ancestors like Australopithecus. However, by the time of the Neanderthals and the 1.6 million-year-old Homo erectus, this adaptation was beginning to take shape. The physical ability to sustain long sequences of sound evolved as a prerequisite for the complex vocalizations that would follow. Even with the right hardware, the transition to language required a fundamental shift in social interaction. In the primate world, communication is largely based on costly signals. When a monkey screams in pain, the signal is intrinsically reliable because it is hard to fake. Human words, however, are cheap signals. They cost almost nothing to produce and carry no inherent proof of their truth. This creates an evolutionary problem. Why would a listener ever trust a signal that is so easy to use for deception? Primate social intelligence is often described as Machiavellian, self-serving, and constantly on guard against being tricked. Tecumseh Fitch proposed the mother tongues hypothesis as a crucial middle step to bridge this gap. He argued that language trust first evolved through kin selection, specifically communication between mothers and offspring. Because the survival of the offspring is in the mother's evolutionary interest, the Machiavellian distrust is lowered, creating a safe space for the development of symbolic communication.
As these signals moved beyond the family unit, they required further social stabilization. I. Bolbeck argued that language required obligatory reciprocal altruism, a system of moral regulation to enforce honesty across a community. For language to work, a society must first establish a foundation of mutual trust. One theory suggests this was built through the coevolution of ritual and speech. Before we used words, we used collective rituals, synchronized movements, dances, and chants to generate public accountability. These rituals created a social environment where symbolic facts could be established. Only when a community reached a level of trust where they were not constantly tempted to lie could they stop worrying about the cost of a signal and start focusing on its discriminability. Another perspective is found in Robin Dunbar's grooming and gossip hypothesis. In primate groups, social bonds are maintained through manual grooming. As human ancestors began to live in larger groups, manual grooming became an unaffordable luxury. The solution was vocal grooming. By using pleasing, rhythmic vocalizations, individuals could groom multiple allies at once while keeping their hands free for foraging or tool-making. Over time, these socially bonding sounds evolved into narration, allowing us to share information about people who were not present. This shift toward complex communication is mirrored in our technological history. The creation of Acheulean hand axes, appearing about 1.8 million years ago, represents a milestone in human cognition. To make one, the toolmaker must have a preconceived idea of the final shape. Functional transcranial Doppler ultrasonography, FTDC studies, have found that the brain areas used for the complex planning of these tools overlap significantly with the areas used for language production. This suggests that the cognitive muscles required for structured tool-making and the structured sequences of grammar evolved together in a feedback loop of innovation. Genetics provides another layer of evidence. The FOXP2 gene plays a crucial role in the fine motor control of the mouth and face. Mutations in this gene in modern humans lead to severe speech disorders. Interestingly, Neanderthals possessed the same version of the FOXP2 gene that we do. This implies that the motor control necessary for speech was likely present in our common ancestor, showing that the biological prerequisites for complex vocalization were being assembled hundreds of thousands of years ago. The emergence of grammar itself may have been a process of self-organization.
We see this in how children develop new languages, such as Nicaraguan Sign Language, where a group with no common tongue spontaneously created a system with stable rules in a single generation. Computational models show that when a population tries to learn sounds from one another, a structured system naturally emerges. Speakers minimize effort, favoring sounds that are easy to produce, while listeners favor sounds that are easy to distinguish.
We can still see the tracks of this process in a phenomenon known as phonologization. It begins with an automatic phonetic side effect. For example, when we produce a voiced consonant like b or d, the vibration of the vocal folds naturally causes the pitch of the following vowel to drop slightly. In the Western dialects of Khmu in Southeast Asia, this physical side effect has been frozen into a grammatical rule. The original distinction between voiced and voiceless consonants was lost, but the difference in pitch remained, creating a new tonal system. Similarly, in the history of English, the presence of a specific vowel in an ending caused the vowel in the root of the word to shift its position in the mouth, a process called umlaut. Even after the ending disappeared, the shifted vowel remained, giving us pairs like foot and feet. These examples show how the laws of physics and the constraints of our anatomy are constantly captured and turned into the rules of grammar. The transition from grunts to grammar was a multifaceted journey where biology and culture were inextricably linked. Our bodies were reshaped to allow for a wider range of sounds. Our social structures were transformed to permit the use of cheap signals through kin selection and moral regulation, and our brains developed a capacity to plan complex sequences. As we moved from emotionally driven calls to abstract symbolic systems, we created a tool that allowed us to build the shared realities that define our species. This synthesis of biological hardware and social software raises a new question. If the machinery was in place, what did the resulting speech actually sound like to the ears of a Stone Age listener? Chapter 5. The Acoustic Texture of Prehistory. The quest to understand the origin of language eventually leads to a fundamental question. What did the first human speakers actually sound like? While we can use phonemic diversity as a clock to estimate the timing of language's birth and map the migration routes that spread these sounds across the globe, the actual acoustic texture of prehistoric speech remains a deep mystery. Because spoken words leave no trace in the fossil record, scientists have had to become creative, blending the fields of paleoanthropology, biomechanical modeling, and comparative linguistics to reconstruct the voices of the past. This process is not about guessing. It is about using the rigid constraints of anatomy and the predictable patterns of sound change to bring speech back from the dead. To begin this reconstruction, researchers look at the hardware of the human voice as a set of inputs for biomechanical models. These models utilize the anatomical facts established by the fossil record, such as the position of the hyoid bone in ancient skulls and the diameter of the vertebral canal in ancestors like the Turkana boy, to estimate the vocal range and respiratory capacity of our predecessors. However, the reconstruction goes beyond mere anatomy to consider the unique way the human vocal tract functions as a sound-producing machine. This mechanical shift relied on the intrinsically digital nature of the human supralaryngeal tract, which functions like a keyboard of movable toggles to produce discrete, categorical sounds. This was a prerequisite for the rapid-fire delivery of modern speech, moving away from the emotional, analog signals of our ancestors toward a system of distinct, symbolic units. The resulting acoustic landscape was anchored by the quantal vowels e, u, and ah, which serve as the stable, universal pillars of human speech. In the reconstruction of ancient voices, these quantal anchors provide the baseline. Even if an ancestor like Lucy lacked the specific configuration to produce a clear E, the absence of these anchors helps researchers define the limits of her communicative reach. This history is further rooted in the size exaggeration hypothesis, suggesting the descended larynx originally evolved to produce deeper, more threatening resonant frequencies. By the time these deep resonance spaces were co-opted for language, the hardware was already tuned for a specific kind of forceful, low-frequency communication. The deep roots of these sounds can be traced back millions of years. Recent research into primate vocalizations has found that baboons are capable of producing contrasting vowel sounds similar to those of humans. This suggests that the physical ability to perceive and produce the core building blocks of speech appeared as early as 27 million years ago. The foundation was there. It just took millions of years of social and cognitive pressure to arrange those sounds into the complex inventories we see today. The cognitive spark for these first words is often linked to the mental architecture required for the deliberate form of Acheulean hand axes. These hand axes are the physical proxies for the first words, marking the moment when random noises began to be shaped into intended, shared symbols.
Early theories regarding these first words have long speculated on how meaning first attached to sound. The bow-wow theory suggests that words began as imitations of animal cries, while the poo-poo theory argues that speech started with involuntary interjections triggered by pain or surprise. The yo-he-ho theory proposes that language emerged from the rhythmic grunts of collective labor. While these are simplifications, they highlight the role of onomatopoeia and sound symbolism as the initial bridge between the environment and the lexicon. In this early stage, high-pitched sounds were likely associated with small objects and low-pitched sounds with large ones, creating a natural, intuitive vocabulary. As these first words evolved, they became subject to the systematic rules of sound change, which act as the physics of language evolution. Linguists use these sound laws to work backward from modern languages to their ancient ancestors, a methodology rooted in the neo-grammarian regularity hypothesis. This principle posits that sound changes are exceptionless and affect all words within a specific phonologically defined set simultaneously. Because these shifts do not pick and choose individual words, but sweep through the entire lexicon like a physical law, they provide a reliable map for reconstruction. For example, the Osno law explains how complex nasal clusters were simplified in Proto-Indo-European based on the position of the word's accent. Similarly, the Boukelos rule describes how certain consonants lost their labialization, the rounding of the lips, when they occurred near specific vowels. These laws show that ancient speech was not a simplified version of modern talk. Rather, it was often phonetically sharper and more complex.
One of the most compelling theories regarding the texture of ancient speech is the glottalic theory. It proposes that early languages, including Proto-Indo-European, utilized ejective consonants, sounds produced by closing the glottis and using a burst of air from the throat rather than the lungs. This would have given ancient speech a crisp, percussive, and forceful quality, very different from the smoother, more fluid sounds of many modern European languages. To a modern ear, the voices of the Stone Age would have sounded remarkably sharp and rhythmic, characterized by these sudden, explosive bursts of air. The final stage of this detective work is linguistic triangulation. By taking contemporary audio recordings of simple words across a wide range of related languages, researchers can work backward through the evolutionary tree to regenerate the audible forms of their common ancestor. This method has been used to reconstruct the spoken sounds of Latin numbers and is now being pushed deeper into the past to recreate the sounds of Proto-Indo-European. This audio reconstruction allows us to hear the echoes of the past, moving beyond the written word to the actual vibrations of ancient speech. When we look at the diversity of sound inventories across the globe today, we see the results of these long-term processes. The vast repertoire of sounds found in the languages of southern Africa, including the complex click systems, represents the pinnacle of this articulatory specialization. These systems, which can include over 100 distinct phonemes, stand in stark contrast to the significantly stripped-down inventories found in the remote corners of the Pacific and South America. This global landscape is the modern result of a journey that began with the digital toggles of the vocal tract and the quantal anchors of the first vowels.
All of these pieces, the digital toggles of the throat, the quantal anchors, the history of size exaggeration, and the cognitive link to tool making, allow us to cautiously imagine the auditory world of the Stone Age. It was a world of sharp ejectives, forceful breath, and percussive rhythms. It was a world where the first onomatopoeic labels were being refined into the building blocks of grammar. Every time we speak, we are using a machine that was millions of years in the making, producing sounds that are the refined echoes of the first words ever uttered in the African Middle Stone Age. These sounds have been filtered through bottlenecks and reshaped by new environments, resulting in the rich acoustic landscape we inhabit today. But if the sounds themselves were the first step, how did these individual units of meaning begin to coalesce into the complex rule-bound structures of the world's first grammars? The phonemic clock has transformed our understanding of the human story, revealing that the sounds we speak are far more than mere tools. They are the statistical echoes of our species' ancient journey. By tracing the clinal decline of phonemic diversity from the heart of Africa to the remote corners of the Pacific, we see the fingerprints of the serial founder effect on our very breath. While debates continue over the exact cradle of speech and the influence of social niches, the evidence remains clear. Language is a deep-seated evolutionary trait, forged through biological adaptation and social trust over hundreds of thousands of years. As we move forward, we carry an acoustic legacy that connects every modern speaker to the first voices of the Middle Stone Age. Our words are the living fossils of our shared history. Thank you for joining us on this exploration.